The secret Daniel kept. Daniel had learned over the past 6 years that the sound of his own family's silence had a particular texture, not empty but crowded, as if every word they refused to send him was still out there somewhere, circling. He was 34 years old, sitting alone in a 2-bedroom apartment in Ohio, with the heat turned down to save money he didn't actually need to save, when his phone buzzed with a text from a number he hadn't seen in 3 years. "Mom's in the hospital, thought you should know, Renee." He read it twice, then he set the phone face down on the counter and finished making his coffee because his hands needed something to do that wasn't shaking. 6 years earlier, Daniel had stood in his parents' dining room in Pittsburgh and told them he wasn't taking a job at Halbrook & Sons, the family's third-generation insurance brokerage, and that he was moving out west to do something with computers. His father, Walt, had set down his fork with the particular quiet violence of a man who believed silverware could communicate contempt. His mother, Carol, had looked at her plate. His older brother, Marcus, had laughed an ugly, disbelieving bark, and asked what exactly Daniel thought he was going to do with computers that the family's 41 employees couldn't do better. His younger sister Renee, 17 at the time, had said nothing at all. She'd learned by then that saying anything in that house was its own kind of risk. Daniel left 3 days later with a duffel bag, $400, and a laptop he'd bought used. Nobody called to check that he'd arrived safely. When he tried calling 6 months later, his father let it ring out. When he tried again at Christmas, Carol answered, spoke for 90 seconds in the careful voice of someone reading from a script, and then said Walt needed the phone for a work call. After the 3rd year of one-sided effort, Daniel stopped trying, not out of spite, out of exhaustion. There's only so long a person can knock on a door before they start wondering if the knocking is actually the problem. What his family didn't know, what nobody but Daniel's business partner and his accountant knew, was that the thing he'd left to do with computers had, in fact, worked. The message from Renee sat on his counter for 11 minutes before he picked the phone back up. What happened? He typed, then deleted it, then typed it again and sent it before he could delete it a 3rd time. "Stroke, she's stable, but they're saying the next 48 hours matter. Dad's a wreck. I didn't know if you'd want to know, but I couldn't not tell you." Daniel stared at the message. 6 years of silence, and the first word to break it was stroke. He thought about the version of himself that would have driven through the night without a second thought, the 28-year-old who still checked his phone every hour hoping someone had finally called. He wasn't sure that version of him still existed, but some older, more stubborn loyalty in his chest made the decision before his pride could weigh in. "I'm coming," he wrote. "Which hospital?" The drive from Columbus to Pittsburgh took just under 3 hours, and Daniel spent most of it in a strange, suspended calm, the kind that arrives after a person has spent years bracing for a blow that never lands and then suddenly does. He didn't call anyone. He didn't rehearse what he'd say. He just drove, hands steady on the wheel of the plain gray sedan he'd bought specifically because it didn't attract attention, and let the fields blur past. He told himself over the years that leaving them behind had been the right call, the only sane response to a family that treated ambition outside their narrow lane as betrayal. He'd built a life. He had in fact built several lives' worth of security, though nobody in that hospital waiting room would know it to look at him. He wore a flannel jacket that was older than his last relationship. He'd never bought a nice car. He still ordered off the value menu out of habit more than necessity. The habit of hiding, he was starting to realize, hadn't ended when he left Pittsburgh. It had just changed shape. The hospital smelled the way hospitals always smell, like antiseptic trying and failing to cover something underneath it. Daniel found the 4th-floor waiting room and saw his father first. Walt, 71 now, gray-faced, hunched forward in a plastic chair like a man 20 years older than the last time Daniel had seen him. Marcus stood by the window, arms crossed, phone in hand though he wasn't looking at it. Renee sat between them, and she was the first to see him. She stood up fast enough that her chair scraped. "You came," she said, and her voice cracked in a way that told him she hadn't been sure he would. "Of course I came," Daniel said, and meant it, and was a little surprised at how much he meant it. Walt looked up. For a long moment, father and son just looked at each other across the fluorescent-lit room, 6 years of accumulated silence sitting between them like a physical thing. Then Walt said, "You didn't have to." It wasn't a thank you, it also wasn't a door slammed shut. Daniel decided to take it as progress. "How is she?" he asked. "Stable," Marcus said, finally looking up from his phone. His voice had none of the old contempt in it, just tiredness. "They did the clot buster thing, now it's wait and see." Daniel nodded and sat down 2 chairs away from his father. close enough to signal he wasn't leaving, far enough to not force intimacy neither of them had earned back yet. The four of them sat in a waiting room that had nothing to say, together in the particular way that estranged families are together, bodies in proximity, everything else still held at arm's length. It was around midnight in the deep hush of a hospital at its quietest hour that Marcus finally spoke to him directly. "You look different," Marcus said. "It's been 6 years. "No, I mean," Marcus gestured vaguely at him. "You look tired, like actually tired, not just I don't know, I thought you'd come back rich and smug, prove us all wrong. Instead you look like you've been sleeping in that jacket." Daniel almost laughed. If only Marcus knew how close to the mark and how far off he was, both at once. "I've been building something," Daniel said carefully. "It's taken a lot out of me." "Building what?" Daniel hesitated. This wasn't how he'd imagined this conversation happening, if he'd ever let himself imagine it at all. He'd pictured a future moment, maybe at a wedding, maybe never, where the truth simply arrived on its own terms, tidy and undeniable. He hadn't pictured a hospital waiting room at midnight, his mother down the hall with tubes in her arm, his brother looking at him like a stranger he half recognized. But something about the room, its rawness, its refusal to let anyone hide behind performance, made the old caution feel suddenly pointless. "A company," Daniel said. "Software. Started it about 4 years ago with a guy I met out in Columbus. We build fraud detection systems for regional banks and credit unions." Marcus frowned. "Okay, and it did well," Daniel said. "Better than well. We sold a majority stake to a bigger firm last spring." "How much better than well?" Daniel looked at his brother, at his father, who had gone very still in his chair, listening now without pretending not to. "Enough that I haven't had to think about money in about 2 years," Daniel said. "Enough that if you're worried about how you're going to cover whatever's coming for mom, rehab, home care, any of it, I want you to know that's not something you need to worry about. I can help. I want to help." The room went silent in a different way than before, not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of people recalculating everything they thought they knew. "You're telling us you're rich," Walt said finally. His voice wasn't accusatory. It sounded almost hollow, like a man testing whether a floorboard would hold his weight. "I'm telling you I did the thing you all thought was a joke," Daniel said, and he kept his voice even because he wasn't trying to win anything, not anymore. "It worked. I didn't come back and rub it in your faces because I didn't come back at all. Nobody called. I figured that was the answer." Carol woke up 2 days later. The stroke had left her with some weakness on her left side and a slur that the doctors said would likely improve with therapy, but her mind was intact, and the first thing she did when she saw all 3 of her children in the room, Daniel included, was start crying in a way that had nothing to do with the stroke and everything to do with 6 years of a decision she'd never had the courage to reverse on her own. "You came," she said to Daniel, echoing Renee's words from 2 nights before, her good hand reaching for his. "I came," Daniel said, and took it. "We should have called you," Carol said. Every single year I told myself I'd call for your birthday, and every year your father said to wait, that you'd come around, that we shouldn't reward." She stopped herself, ashamed of the word before she could finish it. "Reward what?" Daniel asked, not unkindly but not willing to let it slide past unspoken either. "Reward me for leaving, for not doing what Dad wanted." Walt, standing at the foot of the bed, looked like he wanted to disappear into the linoleum. "I thought I was protecting the business," Walt said. "I thought if I let you walk away without consequence it would look like anyone could just leave and it wouldn't matter." "It wasn't about the business," Daniel said. "It was never about the business. It was about you needing me to want what you wanted." Nobody argued with that. Daniel hadn't expected them to, not really. 6 years is a long time for a person to sit with their own choices, and the truth, once it's finally allowed into a room, tends to be recognized immediately by everyone who's been avoiding it. Over the following week, while Carol worked through the first hard days of physical therapy, the Halbrook family did something they hadn't done in years. They actually talked. Not performatively, not at holiday dinners with an audience of relatives keeping everyone polite, but in hospital cafeterias and hallway benches, and once in the parking garage at 2 in the morning when none of them could sleep. Marcus admitted that he'd resented Daniel not because Daniel had left the business, but because Daniel had been the one brave enough to leave it, while Marcus had stayed and slowly discovered he hated insurance almost as much as Daniel apparently had. He just hadn't had the nerve to say so. I've been running the Steubenville office for 9 years, Marcus said, staring at his coffee in the cafeteria's fluorescent light. I don't even like it, I never liked it, I just didn't think there was another option. There's always another option, Daniel said. It's just terrifying to take it without knowing if it'll work. Did you know it would work when you left? No, Daniel said. I had $400 and a laptop and I genuinely thought there was maybe a 30% chance I'd be back within a year, tail between my legs, asking Dad for my old room back. Marcus laughed, a real laugh, the first one Daniel had heard from him since arriving, and instead, Daniel agreed. Renee, who had quietly become the family's only reliable line of communication over the past 6 years, the one who'd kept Daniel's new number, who'd sent the text that started all of this, told him something over dinner one night that landed harder than she probably intended. I used to look you up sometimes, she admitted, just to make sure you were okay. I never found much. You don't really have a presence online. On purpose, Daniel said. I know, I figured, but it made me scared sometimes that you were struggling somewhere and too proud to say anything. I pictured you barely getting by. I never once pictured, she gestured at him, whatever this actually is. I wasn't hiding success, Daniel said slowly, working it out loud for maybe the first time. I think I was hiding the fact that succeeding without you all didn't feel like the victory I thought it would. It just felt like proof that I really was on my own. Renee's eyes went wet. You weren't supposed to be on your own. That was never supposed to happen. I know that now, Daniel said. I don't think I knew it then. Carol came home 3 weeks later, walking with a cane and a stubbornness that the doctors said would serve her well in recovery. Daniel stayed in Pittsburgh through most of it, working remotely from his childhood bedroom, which Walt had almost sheepishly never turned into anything else. He paid for the home health aid without being asked and without making a production of it. He fixed the porch steps that had been rotting since before he left, not because anyone asked him to, but because it felt good to put his hands into something that mattered to people who mattered to him. He and Marcus started talking most evenings, sometimes about nothing, sometimes about the business, sometimes about the years they'd lost, which neither of them could get back, but both of them slowly were learning to stop mourning quite so hard. With Walt, things moved slower. There was no single conversation that fixed 6 years of a father's stubborn pride, no clean scene where everything was suddenly forgiven. Instead, there were small moments, Walt asking unprompted what Daniel's company actually did, and listening to the answer instead of waiting for his turn to talk. Walt showing up at the hardware store while Daniel was buying lumber for the porch, and staying to help without being asked. Walt saying one evening, almost too quietly to hear, I should have called. You should have. Daniel agreed. He didn't say it to wound. He said it because pretending otherwise would have cheapened whatever they were building now. I don't know how to make up 6 years, Walt said. You don't, Daniel said, you just don't lose the next 6. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. Daniel didn't move back to Pittsburgh. He didn't fold his life into the shape his family had once wanted for him, and he made it clear gently but firmly that he wasn't interested in being defined by what he could now afford to give them. The money had opened a door, but it wasn't the reason he'd stayed in that hospital waiting room, and he needed them to understand the difference. What did change was smaller and in its own way harder one. Sunday calls became a habit again, awkward at first, then less so. Renee visited him in Columbus that spring and cried a little when she saw the modest apartment he actually lived in, the one that looked nothing like what a person worth what he was worth was supposed to live in. You could have anything, she said, looking around. Why do you live like this? Because I spent 6 years learning that the things I actually wanted were never about money, Daniel said. I just needed somebody to still want them from me too. Marcus left the family business 11 months later. Not dramatically, not in anger, just quietly and with Walt's blessing, something that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. He went back to school for physical therapy, a career he said he'd wanted since he was 19 and had never once mentioned to anyone. Walt never fully learned how to say the things Daniel needed to hear. Some fathers don't. But he called every Sunday at 6 o'clock without fail for the rest of his life, and eventually Daniel understood that the call itself was the apology, an unglamorous, repeated, deliberate refusal to let the silence win twice. The secret Daniel had carried for years had never really been about the money. It was the quieter, harder truth underneath it, that he had built an entire life alone rather than risk being told one more time that who he was wasn't enough. What his family discovered in that hospital wasn't just his success, it was how much it had cost him to stop needing them to see it. And what Daniel discovered in turn was that being finally seen didn't erase the years of not being seen at all, but it did slowly make room for something new to grow in their place.